Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Here we discuss the hot issues for this year's two sessions, the most important annual meeting on China's political agenda. In July last year, China's central government initiated a double reduction policy. It aims to reduce the homework load for young children and the amount of after-school tutoring. It is my honor today to have Richard Greco Jr., president of the Montfort Academy, and Professor Wang, director of the Chinese Society of Educational Development Strategy, as our guests today. Welcome to both of you. Your participation will help our viewers understand how China and the U.S.'s education systems differ from each other and why.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let me start with you,
Good
Mr.
evening.
Greco. The Montfort Academy is one of the most prestigious high schools in America. You call yourself a preparatory school for college. Please share with us some of your ideas and your visions about education before university.
Sure. Thank you again. So, the Montfort Academy is a classical curriculum high school, and that means we draw heavily upon the contributions of the ancient Greeks to human knowledge. So, the Greek philosopher Socrates said the beginning is the most important part of any work, especially in the case of a young and tender child. For that's the time which the character is being formed and the desired impression is more readily taken. So that quote from Socrates really captures how I view this important stage of child development, the teenage years right before university, when children are the most impressionable. I believe that the purpose of education comes down to one thing: the formation of good character, the formation of one's intellect to seek wisdom, the formation of virtue like courage and confidence and moral excellence, and the formation of one's body through athletics. So at the Montfort Academy, the human person develops in balance, mind, body, and character, and in friendship with one another. So I also believe that important skills should also develop in high school, like how to think logically, how to write convincingly, and how to speak in public confidently. Because a person who can think logically and speak and write with confidence can do anything he sets his mind to. And so at our school, all students study through the Socratic method of classroom discussion. They take oral exams in front of their teachers and in front of their fellow students, because a true test of mastery of knowledge is one's ability to stand in front of teachers and peers and successfully explain a concept or a principle. And even if they fail at first, the teacher will lead them and ultimately draw out the knowledge a student has.
These visions absolutely sound impressive, but I do want to press you, Mr. Greco, on the day-to-day operations here. For example, how much emphasis do you place on academic performances and on scores?
We place a very heavy emphasis on it, but we're not consumed by it. So, in other words, students look at grades as a measure of performance, but what we emphasize to our students is incremental increase. So it may not matter that you start here or you start here. What matters is your improvement from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next. We have a very significant intellectual and academic preparation. And that's seen also in our college acceptances. So you may have seen that during the pandemic, standardized tests in general in the United States are falling away, or at least temporarily. Many of the most prestigious colleges and universities no longer look just to scores.
Exactly.
They look to other things like character, like confidence, friendship, the ability of students to interact with one another and to interact with adults. And that is becoming more and more a focus, even of college admissions. We've already had that as the focus of our education, but now more and more colleges are moving away from scores and looking to these other more intangible things.
And a lot of American universities are making that permanent. It's not just a temporary let go of standardized tests. Professor Wang, isn't that just beautiful what Mr. Greco just said? The balance that educators have to strike between, of course, wanting their students to do well academically, but then not judging them, not scoring them only on their academic performances. For our viewers that are less familiar with China's education reforms, can you remind us, Professor Wang, why China is implementing this double reduction policy? I mean, obviously, on the surface, it aims to reduce the workload, the amount of homework on the back of Chinese students. But why is it necessary to ban off-campus tutoring here in China?
Well, the first is to educate the well-rounded or holistic development students. Well, central to such holistic development are ethics and morals. For example, the first is integrity, that is upholding the right values, and the second is one is the passion towards life, nature, and the world. All this won't be acquired through reading books or sitting in the classrooms, and they can only be acquired by interacting with people, society, and the world. So the purpose of this double reduction policy is to return the time that students should spend on fostering such ethics and morals through the participation in the community activities and also other activities rather than just staying in the classroom. And the second is, it is fine, it is workable when these after-school tutoring institutions serves as a complement of the in-school education. But when they have outnumbered or even overshadowed the mainstream education, it becomes a problem. So the purpose of this education is really a restructuring of education institutions. That is to give the access in terms of the supply side to all the to the students with the accessible and equitable education resources offered on campus. And then the third thing is education essentially is public good. So it should not be provided by for-profit or lucrative businesses that involve too much of the marketing and profit making. This really impacted upon the equity of the education. And when some people can spend more disposable budgets on off-campus or after-school tutoring than other people, and also this impacts negatively on people's well-being. And when these after-school tutoring have taken too much away time from students' life and their family's life, and also taken too much of their budgets from their family's wealth.
Understood.
So the purpose is to achieve the well-being, and that's also part of the goal of the better off society in China.
Professor Wang, I saw Mr. Greco nod quite a bit while you were speaking about the rationale behind this policy. I mean, we used to feel the huge differences between an American education and a Chinese education. Now it seems that a lot of these gaps in terms of values and visions are being bridged. Actually, the two different systems share many of the same common values. That's what Mr. Greco was nodding to while you were speaking. So I was wondering, Mr. Greco, how do American educators reflect on the burden placed on their students in terms of academic burden, in terms of the amount of homework, the workload? Is that an issue?
Well, I think that Professor Wang captured it really quite beautifully. If we are going to have as educational goals the formation of values, moral excellence, social interaction, and some of the other things that she mentioned, students do need time for those activities. So part of education in the United States is a homework load. I'd say, at least at the Montfort Academy, our homework load is 2 to 3 hours a day. And that is
Does that
about
depend on
6
grade?
days. No, that's across the board. Now, of course, students in the senior year have a lot of things to do, particularly with their college applications. And so that's not really quite classroom homework, but it certainly is an academic load because it's a very heavy, intensive process. But part of the education, really not just limited to the Montfort Academy, but across the board in the United States, public and private education too, is the existence of extracurricular activities, whether it's a chess club, the astronomy club, theater organizations, or sports. And so the well-rounded person that Professor Wang described is formed through these other activities. So I actually was encouraged by what Professor Wang was saying about increasing the focus on some of the more intangible things, but ultimately the things that are very concrete when one goes out into the world, in social interactions, confidence, the ability to think well.
Got it.
And so I agree with your statement that it appears that that bridges are being built over the gaps that potentially once existed.
Let me also get your take on another thing Professor Wang said just now about how education should be a public good and for the public good,
Yes.
and therefore it should not be purely after profit. I mean, how do private schools fit in that picture? Some have complained that private schools are run like a business and therefore for profit, and there are so many decision-making the decision-making process revolves around how to make more money. Your take on that?
So we have to distinguish between the words private and the words for profit,
Okay.
because there is such a thing as not-for-profit private institutions. The Montfort Academy, for example, and I think really the majority of private schools in the United States are not-for-profit entities. The Montfort Academy, for example, runs at a deficit. And so it costs more to run the school than tuition brings in. And I think that's very common too among private schools. And we depend on donations from private individuals, sometimes foundations, who share our educational mission and objectives. And that's how we break even every year and are able to go from one year to the other. So I agree entirely that education is a public good, that education is essential to the future of society, to the future of civilization, the preparation of generation to generation. So I do agree with that. And again, while you can't operate perpetually in deficit, and you do have to pay attention to the business of running an enterprise, a not-for-profit business does ultimately have to break even from year to year in order to continue. Otherwise, it just can't continue.
Right. It has to be sustainable. Otherwise, it can't just
Correct.
operate for a prolonged period of time. Professor Wang, coming to you now. Now we are about half a year after the introduction of that double reduction policy. What is your assessment on how well the policy has worked? Has there been a noticeable improvement in education quality? Have the problems that you raised just now been addressed by this policy?
Well, this really depends on how you define the quality of education. I think this reform of double reduction policy is premised on the concept of the education quality as the holistic development of each individual student, relating to the well-being of their family and the well-being of the whole society. So having said that, this policy has worked well because they have allowed more time and more resources for students to achieve the holistic development in terms of the ethical, physical, cognitive, aesthetical, and practical developments. That's the definition of the uh, goal of education in China. And also, I noticed, according to the international studies across the world, there is more and more consensus across countries about the definition of education quality. So people now more and more recognize that achievement is not limited to the development of cognitive skills per se, but also focus on what kind of persons our young generation will become in the future. So this reform actually will allow the more opportunities and also more resources for students to develop their social emotional skills and also to develop other soft skills rather than just knowledge and skills itself. And according to the survey, there has been some recent survey that's the evaluation of the result of this reform. And I believe it found out that this policy has been well received among a big proportion or even majority of the students and their families because this double reduction policy could allow more time for students to enjoy their study and also
I
allow
see.
more budget and resources for their families to live a more healthy and prosperous life.
Mr. Greco, let's talk about the role of American parents in their children's education. Part of the reason why that double reduction policy was introduced was because Chinese parents were simply too heavily involved in their children's after-school work. They were required and expected to play a supervising role. That expectations came from schools and teachers. What do you think of the involvement of American students? Is it too much? Is it too little?
Parents play a range of roles, and some parents are just too busy to be involved. Many families in the United States, I'd say the majority of families in the United States, have a working mother and a working father. And so it just depends. But one thing is certain, parents do play a role. At least from a school's perspective, it's our hope that parents will reinforce what we are trying to achieve as educators in this holistic approach that Dr. Wang spoke about, where we are forming intellect, where we're forming character, where we're forming physical development as well. And likewise, even if parents are busy working and providing for the family, they expect that the school will do the same, reinforce what they are trying to teach. The primary educators, we believe very strongly that the primary educators in any child and any child's life are the parents. The school is really the secondary educator. Now, yes, of course, students spend most of their time at a school during a day. But then, upon, going home and on the weekends and during vacations, of course, it's the parents. And so a partnership does emerge, and it should be a very well balanced uh, partnership. We have the advantage, at least in our school, that parents and teachers are frequently in contact. We have an average class size of about 15 students. We have a student to teacher ratio of about 7-to-1. And so with such small numbers per class and many teachers per student, we're able to foster a very frequent communication, even with very busy parents. And I think this is very important. In fact, when I evaluate my teachers, the frequency of communication with parents and the quality of communication with parents is one of the factors for a teacher's evaluation. It seems to work. It seems to work well, particularly when it comes time for students to apply to university, because at that point, the parents, no matter how busy they are, really do become involved because it's not just a
Same here.
student-driven process. It's
Yeah,
a family-driven process
absolutely.
where our guidance counselors sit down with the student and families, try to understand the student's goals, intellectual goals, professional goals, social goals, and try to identify the colleges that are the best match. And we really do that in partnership. And last year, for example, 30% of we always have 100% college placement. Everyone who attends the Montfort Academy goes to college. But last year, 30% of the graduating class was accepted at the top 1% of American colleges, like MIT, Cornell, Columbia, Northeastern, the University of Virginia. And that happens really because the parents are involved, we are involved, the student is engaged in the process, puts his or her best foot forward, really creates a picture of who that individual is.
Right.
And that's involved. It requires
Yeah.
time. So this kind of partnership does exist.
Yeah. You mentioned the importance of extracurricular activities, which now can weigh more heavily, more prominently on a graduate's application to college because a lot of American universities are no longer requiring standardized test results. What type of resources and support do you provide to your students in terms of their extracurricular activities?
Sure. So I just would like to mention one other thing that's emerged from our own research during this pandemic-driven movement away. But even before the pandemic, certain colleges were placing much less emphasis on the standardized tests. And we're seeing that more and more colleges are putting on their websites very explicitly that they're seeking students of good character. And so that's something that is intangible, although it does come through the students' activities, including leadership in these extracurricular activities. So at a school like the Montfort Academy, we have well over 20 extracurricular activities, from chess to astronomy to art to robotics,
Your sports
all
team seems
sorts
to
of
have
different.
done really well.
Well, thank you, thank you. Yes, we have basketball, and we're usually champions in our leagues in basketball. The same with soccer. We have volleyball for girls and softball for girls. Baseball too. We don't have football, but we do have these other sports, and there too, teamwork, and then becoming a captain or a co-captain or some sort of leadership role is important and is reflected in the college applications and the way colleges view our students. That type of leadership and character are very important in college admissions. As for resources, just one comment on resources. As the president of an institution, I think that my principal role is to find the very best teachers, because ultimately it's the teachers that are the finest and best resource that a school has. No matter how much money is invested in computers, no matter how much money is invested in technology or sports equipment or whatever the case might be, it's the teachers. It's that one-to-one interaction between teacher and student that is the treasure of a school. And so I look for teachers who view teaching as a vocation, teaching as a calling, almost a divine type of a mission to help form an individual in this mind and character. And so our teachers are also the supervisors for every extracurricular activity. So students develop a really beautiful relationship with their teachers, both in the classroom, in the hallways, and also after school through the extracurricular activities.
Got it. Got it. Professor Wang, coming to you now. The Chinese government obviously aiming for a higher quality in-school education. and to restrict the wild growth of after-school competition. Why is China's education industry changing its direction, and can you tell us where it is going?
Actually, the after-school tutoring went helps or complements the on-campus education. Well, it's acceptable and it's also consistent with the goal of education for holistic development. But when it involves more and more for-profit making and also taking away too much of the students' time from their study and also taking away too much of families' resources for their well-being, and it has become a problem. So the purpose of this reform, the first is to return the education as the public good to the whole society, and also the ultimate goal of this education reform is to enable the on-campus education reform or pedagogical innovation in terms of, for example, curriculum development and implementation, and also assessment and evaluation, and also the overall education restructuring in China. So going forward, I can foresee that the first is there will be much less for-profit after-school institutions that have negative impact on the students' learning and teachers' teaching. The second is there will be some not-for-profit training institutions that can serve the students and their families with more interest-based courses and programs, for example, focusing on the arts and sports. And then the third thing is I would see more school-based education reform. For example, one thing that accompanied the double reduction policy is the reshuffling or redistribution of education resources across the schools. For example, just now you mentioned the teachers. So one thing that government is doing is to reallocate the teachers across the schools. That is to allocate the teachers from better performing schools to low achieving schools, and also even to allocate the principals of those top performing schools to those low achieving schools. In this way, the education resources will be distributed more equitably across the schools within one province or within one region. So everybody can have more equitable access to the schools. In that case, we will gradually achieve the goal of not only education quality but
Right.
also education equity.
Right. Mr. Greco, on the topic of professional goals, I do have an interesting question for you I'd like to pick your brain on. You had a background in finance before you became an educator. One would say you had a stellar career in finance. The phenomenon here in China is a lot of Chinese high school graduates want to study finance in college. They want to major in finance and go find jobs in VC or PE because that's where the money is. Is there a similar trend in America in your observation? And what would be your advice if students came up to you and said, I want to make money. I want to major in finance. I want to be an investment banker after college. Your advice?
Well, it's a very good question, and it is a question that I face as an educator. First and foremost, even from my own personal experience, and this is what I share very personally with students, the bottom line is money does not make you happy. Money is not the root of personal happiness. In fact, very often money is the root of personal sadness. And I think that we need
That
to
is
be very
debatable.
yes, it is debatable, but my experience and the experience of others I know is that yes, money, of course, can allow for certain freedom, less of certain worries. But the more this set of worries goes down, the more this set of worries goes up. I think we need to promote that which brings personal happiness, and that's not fluff. That's not
But personal happiness is not guaranteed by any specific job in any specific sector.
No, that's exactly right. And this is the point, that it's not the job, it's not the profession, it's the
Mm,
inside of the individual. It's the
mm,
good character, it's the relationships that one has with one's parents, with one's grandparents, with one's friends, with
mm,
one's coworkers and colleagues. That is a very significant part of
mm.
personal happiness. And that's why the sooner students can be introduced to building relationships and the importance of relationships and the importance of character, the more important that becomes, the less important the pursuit of money
Mm,
becomes. Now, that said, we want our students to be very successful and to be very prosperous.
mm,
I would say the vast I'd say 60% of our students at the present time
mm.
are interested in the healthcare field, whether it's
Wow.
medicine, nursing, physical therapy, occupational therapy. More and more students are going into that area.
How does
I'd
that
say the
happen? Is there a
next biggest
particular part of your curriculum that focuses on this? Are they nudged in a way towards this area of expertise?
No, I do think, I do think that students feel that it is a vocation, a calling, a
Mm,
beautiful way to interact with other people,
that's true.
too,
Mm,
right? And to bring wellness to others.
yeah.
I think after and we do have a very strong science program. We have a very strong biology program.
Mm,
Have a very strong physics and chemistry
mm,
and astronomy
mm.
program also,
And that's what they will need if they
particularly
want to
in
go
lab.
into healthcare related professions.
Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And there are certain colleges in the area too that are focusing more and more, putting more money into those areas. I'd
Mm,
say the second largest category is engineering
mm,
after that, where students want to go into. Followed by that, I'd say law. And I'd say only a handful actually want to go into finance and investment banking.
mm,
And when they do, I sit down with every one of our students
mm-hmm.
throughout the year, have lunch with them, get to know them. But particularly in the senior year, if they say to me they're interested in finance, investment banking, private equity, venture capital, I share my own very personal experiences with
Mm,
them, both the very good and the very bad, and just want them to be as prepared as they can when they go off and study. Now,
right.
finance, of course, is beautiful. Um, there's very little that happens in the world without money. No
Got it.
question about that.
Understood. Professor Wang, Mr. Greco, I get a level with you. I went into today's interview fully expecting clashes in ideas and visions, but I'm happy to see that the two of you are agreeing with each other more often than not. One last question to both of you, starting with Professor Wang here. What can China and the U.S. learn from each other in terms of education? I mean, the Chinese education has been criticized as being focusing too much on rote learning, too much memorizing, a lack of focus on creativity. That is now changing, Professor Wan. What can China learn from the U.S.? What can the U.S. learn from China at this point?
Well, I would like to say the education system in the US and in China deeply rooted in each of their own culture and history,
Mm,
uh, are different and would be different in the long term, over the long run. But I also see more convergence and even commonality across these two education systems, especially in terms of balancing the uniformity and diversity in the context of China. And the current reform, also if we look back at the past few decades of education reform in China, well, I can see that what has been built into the education system by drawing upon the experiences of the U.S. and other developed economies and countries is to building more choices. Number one. The second, building more flexibility. Number two, and then also building more diversity into our education systems. For example, for the education, for the curriculum, instead of just uniform curriculum for all the schools, now we have the national curriculum, local curriculum, and school-based curriculum, and the local education authority, and even each school have their own autonomy to develop the curriculum that tailor into the characteristics or needs of their own region and also of their own school. And also in terms of school, there are also I see much more variety of choices of the schools that the families and the students can access to nowadays. And another thing is the flexibility. Well, instead of just one pathway, we call it a single log pathway to the college and the universities. Now, for example, for entering into the top performing school of world-class university of Tsinghua University, there is much more choices or much more options of pathways to go to those kind of universities in China. So that's more choices in education systems. I think that's what we learned from the U.S. system.
All right, Mr. Greco, now if you would shed light on mutual learning between the two countries.
Yes, I think like, not that I expected clash, but I expected actually more differences than similarities, and I think that the vision that Dr. Wang laid out for us is very laudable. Now, of course, the United States, unfortunately, does not always perform, United States students don't always perform well on scores and exams. And sometimes, we might place, let's say, in between 50% and 75% according to world systems. So that's unfortunate, particularly I'd say in mathematics. And so we potentially could learn because clearly Chinese students almost always place at the very top of those tests. On the other hand, I think that this whole notion of holistic development and the development of a student's innate gifts and innate talents and sparking of intellectual curiosity, sparking of passion is one of the greatest strengths of the American system. And so the fact that China is paying more attention to that and is trying to do very concrete things to implement that is really quite laudable. I think that one of the most important things that we actually can do is to have more conversations like this that we're having right now, because each of us is certainly very proud of our systems, and to hear from educators what works best, what really is working. So if we can agree that this is a goal, and we both think that we're arriving there, well, what works best and how can we share those things? And so I would welcome more conversations like this.
And we would welcome these conversations to take place on our CGTN platform. Professor Wang, Mr. Greco, what an informative and insightful discussion with both of you. We appreciate your area of expertise, and thank you so much for making time for us today. Professor Wang, Mr. Greco, appreciate both of you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this episode of Face to Face. We have more coming up in the series. Make sure you stay with us right here on CGTN.